Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our discussion, Washington Lee, Washington Liberty, a Retrospective. I'm Charlie Clark. I write the Our Man in Arlington column for the Falls Church News Press, and I do a lot of local history. I'm also a graduate of Yorktown High School, but this fine crowd tonight won't hold that against me. Now, as you may know, the debate over changing the name of the school is over. The name has been changed as of next fall. But tonight we're going to examine the process for the name change as best we can, and we'll review the merits of the name change in the process. If we can understand the politics that led to the decision to change Lee to Liberty, perhaps we can avoid the animosity and controversy that sometimes surrounds these kinds of debates. Joining me tonight is Jeremy Mayer, a 1986 graduate of W&L and a political science professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Public Policy and Government. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Also with us is Dean Fleming. Dean is a government contractor and vice president of the Washington Lee Alumni Association. He has the distinction of not only graduating from W&L in 1975, but he also graduated in 1972 from Stratford Junior High School, which has also had its name changed. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Charlie.
And finally, we have the audience, who we invited members of the community who may have an interest in this topic. A little bit later, they'll have a chance to make some remarks and ask questions. But first, we'll start with Jeremy. Tell us what brought about this name change.
Well, I'm actually not an expert on the process, but this is happening all over the country. I think it has a lot to do with black political power rising up. If you look at the number of elected African Americans all across America, the numbers were very small up into well into the 80s and 90s. And so as African Americans achieve more and more political power, having Confederate-linked names on buildings, particularly schools, becomes more of an obscenity. And when I went to W&L, it really wasn't an issue at all. We didn't talk about it. It was just Robert E. Lee and George Washington. We didn't think about it. But I think that more and more people today are looking at this and saying, if we don't have to do this, why would we?
Was it also prompted by the violence in Charlottesville?
Oh, absolutely. The immediate precipitant was Charlottesville. Charlottesville, I think, was a wake-up call for many Americans of all races that virulent anti-black, anti-Jewish racism and anti-Semitism is very much alive. I think President Trump has made it okay to be a white supremacist now in a way that we haven't seen since maybe the George Wallace campaign of 1968.
Well, Dean, how does that explanation sit with you?
We see these issues being raised a lot due to a political nature. Politicians are going out of their way to find a divisive topic, latch on to it, when there really isn't the push in the public to do these things. You know, for example, Washington Lee had 2 emails delivered to them prior to Charlottesville to change the name of Washington Lee. So if there was a big push over the years, some of those 235,000 people that live there would have been pushing for this. The black community, you know, anybody you can possibly think of. The fact of the matter is there wasn't a big push. There still isn't a big push. That's what the numbers say. Certainly there are a lot of people that can be offended by slave plantation names, and if they are, you know, we recognize that. But I think what's happening is there's a lot of divisiveness being stirred up in communities that, quite frankly, don't need it. The Washington Lee community is very diverse, very inclusive. The kids pretty much will tell you, we don't need this. We have things under control. So that's the perspective for many of us.
Mm-hmm. And the school board chairman at the time, Barbara Cannon, seems to have been instrumental. Is that your understanding of it too? Or?
Barbara did spearhead the effort back in August 2017, within a week of Charlottesville, where she made a statement that the Arlington should look at the names of all the schools. Within a matter of minutes, 2 of her school board members, James Lander and Reed Goldstein, both said, wait a minute, pump the brakes. We don't want to knee-jerk react here. Let's really look at this to see if it's something we want to do and involve the community.
Arlington is in the process of opening or building 4 or 5 new schools too, so they had to come up with names for the new ones, and so they took that opportunity to restudy the whole process for naming schools. Okay, well, in the process, there was controversy not just on the substance of whether Robert E. Lee's name should come off, but on how the process unfolded, how much community participation there was. So, Dean, tell us a little bit about how the objections that you have raised on many occasions about how the process itself worked.
The school board in the fall of 2017 started a process that they initiated. They were going to have a naming committee, staff committee put together that never really never materialized until after FOIAs in the April, May of 2018. That committee was supposed to chair this process, move it along. Instead, they hired George Mason's
School
School of Conflict Analysis, yes, who did a nice job doing a study. They never asked the question, do you want to change the name WNL, to all the people they interviewed and whatnot. But they put forth a recommendation to the school board to slow the process down, separate the process between new schools and existing school naming. And the school board took that to heart, and in late January, early February, and everybody has a handout that explains this, they put forth a process to slow it down, separate it, and then create an ad hoc committee to meet in this past fall to decide if the community thought the name should be changed. Instead, on June 7th, the school board, with no notice whatsoever, after publicly putting forth this process, praising it, adopting it, moving forward with it, right up until the week before they voted, they just slid in a quick vote to change it to WNL because, quite frankly, that's what they wanted to do.
Okay, I think there was a couple other steps in there. I believe there were some town hall meetings where there was an opportunity. I'm not sure how well publicized they were. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, for people to come participate in the discussions. And I believe they came up with some guidelines that they modeled on what Yale University had done when Yale had taken the name of John C. Calhoun off of a building. And that's where the school board, is my understanding, came up with this concept of principal legacy. And so what happened at that meeting a week before the June 7th vote was where the staff presented their guidelines and framework, where they talked about whether plantations are offensive as names because slaves were worked on those plantations, and they decided that they were not. And they also addressed the whole issue of whether George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's names should be removed because they were slave owners. And that's where they determined that it's the principal legacy of the personage is what should be debated. So it's on that night when they presented the guidelines, they said that Robert E. Lee was the one who could be ruled out under these guidelines because his principal legacy, not that he was a slave owner, which though he was, his wife was, but that he had betrayed the Union in inciting, going to lead the Confederate forces. So, Jeremy, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that whole process of consulting with Yale, town meetings,
Sure.
principal legacy.
So I'm very sympathetic to this principal legacy idea because I hear from several people, and Dean actually made this argument to me once, where if we start taking Lee's name off, where will it end? Because we'll have to take Jefferson's name off. We'll have to take George Washington's name off. But you don't. George Washington was a flawed man because he owned humans. But we don't recognize and memorialize him for that. He was an essential leader of the early nation. In fact, he agonized over slavery and freed his slaves upon his death, which Jefferson wanted to do, but he was such a bad money manager, he couldn't. So I think that there is no reason to keep Lee's name on the school. When I talk to people about this, no one ever has a good reason for keeping Lee's name on the school other than it was there when I went there. Well, you know, damn it. They took the name of Page off my elementary school because he was a stone racist writer. We're all going to survive. It didn't erase history. I still went to that school. Everyone's going to live. So in 4 years, This will be fine. Alumni will get together over beers and say, well, I wish they hadn't changed the name. But guess what? The Washington Lee that I went to, they knocked the building down. That's a much bigger loss to me emotionally in my memories than the name on it.
Very interesting. So I want Dean to respond to that, but I want to also point out that Robert E. Lee is a homeboy, too. The Arlington House is in our own county, which...
Great, and Robert E. Lee, when he invaded the North, he took free blacks back to slavery. So for me, it is like if we were in Vietnam and the South Viet and the capitalists took over again and democracy reigned, they wouldn't keep Ho Chi Minh's name on a school. They wouldn't keep his name on a building. When you go to Germany, you don't see schools for Goebbels and Rommel because they lost and they did evil things. Take Lee's name off it. He lost, he did evil things.
So Dean, I'd love to hear your reaction.
I'd actually like to go back to the process momentarily first to explain that the town hall meetings you're talking about, those took place in the George Mason period back in late November, early December. So after that period of time, there was no other community outreach. The school board created a process, they adopted it. It was actually a very fair process. They publicized it, they ran it right up until June 7, and then they, quite frankly, just snuck a vote in. They trashed that entire process. Then they doctored the agenda because it wasn't on the agenda.
There was a week delay. I mean, I was at both meetings. Where they adopted the staff guidelines and announced that a vote would be taken in 1 week, and then it was. Yeah.
The week before, May 31st, they presented the criteria as an information item. The following week, they would vote on that item, and that's what was publicized, that we would have an information item on the process. And the documents I handed out here show that you had a process meeting on the 31st, a vote on June 7th that did not include W&L, was not on the agenda for June 7th, and then they added it to the agenda after the fact. Okay. So that's one of the rather egregious items that they did.
That became one of the issues in the lawsuit that 3 students filed, which a judge rejected but may be revived, I understand.
It's in an appeal process.
Yeah. Well, but let me ask you this. If you've been given more time than just 1 week from with this new guidelines, what would the people who want to preserve Washington Lee as the name have done differently? What arguments might they have introduced that they didn't introduce already?
I don't think it would have gotten to that. What would have happened is the school board would have followed the process that they put forth. They wouldn't have called for a vote on June 7th or June 14th or anything. It was going to be a process where the community would meet in the fall. They would return, and this was to decide if the community wanted to rename W&L or not to pick a name. That was an ad hoc committee that was very clearly laid out. Then in December or January, the school board would then, upon that recommendation, make a vote to either keep the name or change the name. Then that would kick off a new name selection process. So the community is aggrieved because the school board basically had a process that for almost 6 months they laid out and then just jettisoned it.
The community is aggrieved. What happened to this evil Barbara Cannon?
What happened to her?
Yeah, where is she now?
She's still on the school board.
Okay, so
she won her re-election.
Yeah,
of course.
It would be my point.
It's Arlington.
So if she did this horrible, horrible thing that the community is mad about, it seems strange that she won an election. Because I'm very sympathetic, Dean, to the idea that some bad things were done in this process, that people were promised a certain process and it wasn't delivered. But that's what happens in representative democracy. We are not a perfect democracy where everyone is equal. We elect people to make decisions. We're a republic.
Dean, I want you to address this question of whether the people who want to preserve the name admire Robert E. Lee.
Some do, some don't. I think a lot of people stick with the global view that's been out there for 150, 60 years that complicated man, yes, entered the war not to preserve slavery or to fight to preserve slavery, to protect his fellow Virginians, his family, his farm, his home. You have to remember this man had 75,000 troops lined up across the river that were going to invade his home. And his heritage of 200 years of the Lees, very prominent family with people that signed the Declaration of Independence, didn't believe in slavery. His wife taught slaves on the plantation. She could have gone to prison for that. Did he fight on the wrong side of that effort? Absolutely. Are there lost causers involved in this? None. Zero. White supremacists? Zero. If they were, we would give them no quarter.
Right.
We're more, the agreement is really more with the process.
Well, let me ask you one other thing about the original name for W&L in 1925. I think it was going to be Central High School at first, and they changed it pretty quickly to Washington Lee.
Yeah.
And this came up in this last year's school board discussion about why pick Washington and Lee in 1925. And the school board members mentioned that the state of Virginia had just passed a Racial Integrity Act and that the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise. And some people interpreted the choice of Lee, putting him on that school, as a part of that way of sending a message.
It's just the opposite, actually. It was a reconciliatory name, the blue and the gray, to bring reconciliation. It was actually named after Washington Lee University.
But reconciliation of a particular kind. The 1920s were a very important year for the Lost Causers because they were building Confederate monuments all over the South.
But that's not why they named
But
W&L.
if you're saying it's about reconciliation, the way reconciliation was perceived at that time is whites in the North and whites in the South agree that the Civil War was a terrible thing and that black freedom is off to the side. Both parties were not interested in any moves towards black freedom. This was the height of the Klan. So if it was all about reconciliation, it was reconciliation over the prone figure of oppressed blacks.
The problem here is the process. Okay,
It's
the
just
problem
about
is
the
the process. You've got a school board out of control. These
Well,
five
let me
people.
ask you this, though, Dean, because
democracy is going to solve this problem, Dean. If you
No, it
don't like that
doesn't.
driver, when that driver comes up for re-election, if it truly is the community,
Well, let's
knock
talk
him
about the
down.
polls, too,
Yeah.
because there were some polls taken of the alumni. And why don't you tell us a little bit about those? Because there were really there was an Arl Now reader survey.
There were two, actually.
Yeah, go ahead. Give
So,
us a recap. of those.
2013, the subject of removing Lee's name came up, changed in Washington Lee. 2,647 people responded, Arlington community members. 87.5% came back, do not remove the name. The next poll that was done was not until after they voted to change the name. That was about 8,000 ARL,
okay.
or Arlington Now poll members, and that was about 70%.
Online polls are about as useless as you possibly could have. What you really need to do if you want to know what the people feel is you need to have a random sample of Arlingtonians.
Very
that
good,
was
Jeremy.
never done.
And we
Okay,
would,
so
we
we're
would
gonna
call that a
take-
referendum, a dollar-based referendum, and we put on a vote, and that's actually the fair way to do this and avoid the.
I would
We're going to take
social
some
anxiety.
questions from the audience now. And a brief comment is fine, but we hope you will put it in the form of a question.
My name's George Cranwell. I'm a 1975 graduate of Washington Lee High School. I've lived in Arlington County since 1967. One of the things that I just can't understand about this whole process is how we started a year and a half ago, with the committees that George Mason put together, and we all got in the room and talked about what we liked or didn't like about changing the name. It was clear to me in the committees that I was in that there was a lot of people there that were saying, wait a minute, why are we changing this name?
Did you want to address that to a certain panelist? Or?
I'd address it to you in the middle here. I mean, were you ever at any of these early on?
No,
Yet you have a big opinion now about, why we should change the name.
you're right. So only people that were
do
there
where
in the
do
process.
you where do you live? Do you live in Arlington?
I sure do.
Okay, and you want to change this name?
I do.
Why?
Because I don't think we should be honoring Confederate generals.
Where are you from?
I grew up in Arlington.
Well, were you born here?
I was born at Fort Meade, Maryland, if you must know.
Okay. And when did you move to Arlington?
1970, when I was 2, it wasn't really my choice.
Okay. So, did you go to Washington Lee High School?
I did.
Okay. And you want to change the name
Yes, I do.
because why?
Because I think that in this day and age, having a person who fought for slavery and actually re-enslaved free blacks is a moral evil that can easily be avoided. Now, let me be clear. I don't think this is the most important issue before Arlington, and I'm very open to a budgetary argument against this. So if you came to me and you said, this is going to cost $3 million, right? You might convince me not to change it. But if you're going to say, hey, Lee wasn't so bad, he was nice to his wife, and his wife taught slaves.
Hi, I'm a little short for this mic, but we can make it work. I'm a senior at Washington Lee currently, and the first thing I'd like to note is that we've had a great talk about Black power, and we only have one Black person in this room to discuss this. So representative democracy is kind of questionable. Last year, during Black History Month, there was an assembly. There was a question asked about the name change before it was even a name change. It was just an idea. There was questions about the symbolism of Lee's house being on the Arlington logo and how we all felt about that as students. That is the last time any student was questioned. And it wasn't a formal question by the county, by the board, by anyone. It was student-made and student-selected over a year ago.
Yeah,
Go ahead and give your name once more, please.
Julia Addy.
Julia Addy.
Basically, I just wanted to know why, if any of you do know, why was Washington and only L names considered? Was it a budget purpose so that we wouldn't have to rebrand this lovely symbol here again 50 million times? If we're going to rename a school, shouldn't we have the proper resources to do so?
The committee of volunteers that represented students, faculty, alumni, community people, parents, did consider other names, but there seemed to have been, my understanding is, some kind of consensus that if you did preserve the initials, it would ease the blow a little bit, and it would also save some money. And as it happens, with Washington Liberty, you could still keep the mascot name of Generals, which would save some money and some customs traditions as well.
The main question students are having, though, that I've heard is why not just change it to Liberty? Why not take out the generals? Because we're named the generals, and they're two generals. They're a Confederate and a Union general. They were not slavery. They were not anti-slavery. They were fighting for sides of their country that they believed in and that they sewed back together, and they put both their names on there to bring us back together. So if you're going to take off one, take off both. And that's how I feel as a student.
Okay.
I'd like to speak to that. As
Yes.
far as the naming committee, just to let you know how the naming committee played out. And this kind of speaks to Jeremy's question about polls. So the naming committee that was selected and teed up by the school board specifically excluded almost all alumni. At one point they said, if you're going to be on this committee, an alumni, you have to live in Arlington. That excluded probably about 30,000 alumni. Then they reached out to the community and for input, and these came in the form of 754 emails. And those 754 emails, 85% were against even changing the name, much less recommending another one. They wanted to keep the name Washington Lee, either with Lee or with a different Lee.
But I just want to remind you that the school board had decided to change the name. So
They
the
had.
charter, and they have the authority, so the charter of the committee was to come up with a new name.
It was, that's
not
correct.
to continue debating
May I just
whether to change the name.
That's correct.
Ask, what percentage of those emails were from current students and how many were from angered parents or alumni that aren't currently being affected?
Quite a bit of student emails, probably more from alumni and parents.
The only polls we received were asking which colors we would like changed and if our mascot should stay the same. There were never any questions.
That's right.
about
You guys were
name
never
changing.
polled. You were kept out of the process. And I'd like to speak to that very quickly. The day that you guys were polled, it was a, what is the term that you guys use? The polling? The polling mechanism that you use?
We just used a Google form,
Google, okay. So they had a vote on a Friday. It was a half-day
which is a
school.
voluntary survey.
Yeah, voluntary survey on a Friday, half-day. Monday was a holiday. And in 5 hours, 1,000 people responded to that poll. 1,000 students, excuse me, responded to that poll. So we know it can be done. It's half the students.
If it's only half, you have a problem if there's an intensity measure. So it may not be it is not as good as a randomized sample by any means. Because
But
the more
no,
intense
the real
people
question
respond.
here is, if you don't want to know what people want, don't ask them. The school board never, and the George Mason Group, out of a 145-page document they produced, not one question said, do you want to rename W&L? Not one. You guys were never asked, do you want to rename W&L? The alumni wasn't asked, the community wasn't asked, nobody, because they didn't want the answer.
There was a grave lack of communication on all sides. And I think
Absolutely.
that there's a real issue with the fact that we didn't have this conversation as a community and we're only having it afterwards.
Let's go ahead and get your name, please.
My name is Patrice Kelly, and I was on the renaming committee. And I wanted to correct some misunderstandings. What we were told was not that the name had to change completely from Washington and Lee. And I personally went back to Dr. Kaninen and asked her, can we choose another Lee? And she said, well, of course you can. So we
Okay.
could have kept it Washington Lee. I was told by her.
But
And
Robert
yet-
E. Lee was coming off.
Robert E. Lee, we were told, that was the only instruction we were given, was Robert E.
clarification.
Lee
Yeah.
was coming off. So we were not allowed to discuss that option. However, at the very first meeting, one particular person in the group gave us 3 names that we were to consider: Tubman, Liberty, and Loving. I was open to a name change, and actually Lafayette was one of the points that I had argued for.
Great
And I
idea.
said, hey, let's consider Lafayette, either James Armistead Lafayette or the Marquis de Lafayette, who became a general. Fine. In any case, those were not open discussions. There was intense pressure on the group to select from among Tubman, Loving, and Liberty. My problem is with the process, and I was the one responsible for the survey, unscientific survey, that the school board took, because I was told I was representing the Washington Lee parents. They offered to send a listserv to the parents. I and my husband and others received that listserv, and many people responded to it. 85% said, please don't change the name, or if you must change it, do Washington and another Lee. But I'll tell you honestly, those discussions were repeatedly shut down, and the pressure was intense to choose from among the 3 names that were proffered.
Very interesting.
And we fought to keep Washington, and there was a constant drive to say, let's think about the cost of changing this. We'd have to repaint the bottom of the swimming pool. We'd have to repaint all the walls in the school, and the center hall is tiled as WL. So that was, again, one of the things that we were fighting for, was to at least try to keep Washington in it and keep an L. But frankly, when I found out what the parent community wanted based on this listserv that was done, I felt compelled to turn to Washington Lee. Again, I just wanted to clarify a couple of points that were
Is
raised.
there anybody else who has another question? Yes, Trish.
Hi, my name is Tish Jenkins, and I'm the president of the Washington Lee PTA. And I just wanted to say that what feedback I got was mostly, it was random questions. It was, people saying, why are we doing this? Or, there were a couple of pros, a couple of cons. I didn't have trust me, I hear from parents about all sorts of crazy things. It was not a big concern among the parent community. We decided as a PTA we were not going to take a position one way or another, and we were going to let the school board and the process work itself out. Personally, speaking for me, not for the PTA, I would ask the alumni organization, why, if you have a school name that would make many of your students, we have many students of color at Washington Lee, if it makes them feel uncomfortable or unwanted or unwelcome or in any way unwanted there, why would you want to keep that?
Dean, you have 10 seconds. Please answer.
10 seconds. I think we should ask the students that in a real poll, because I think you'd find there aren't that many offended people out there.
But a poll,
That's what I think.
A poll doesn't show the minority, right?
On that note, I think we're going to have to end it. Thank you all very much for an excellent discussion.
Thank you.